My name is Claire Whitmore. I am 40 years old. I am a forensic accountant. I built my entire life on being careful, honest, and responsible. I know what fraud looks like. That is why I knew, the moment the prosecutor called, that my family didn't just make a mistake. They engineered one. The federal agents were still standing in my kitchen when the prosecutor called. There were 3 of them, all in dark jackets, moving through my home like they already owned it. My accounts had been frozen that morning. My name was attached to $12 million worth of fraudulent approvals inside my father's company, and according to the documents spread across my kitchen table, I was the person who had authorized every single one of them. I stood with my phone pressed to my ear and my free hand gripping the counter because my legs had stopped feeling reliable. The prosecutor's voice was measured and professional. He said he needed me to understand the full scope of what was being alleged. Then he paused and said quietly, "Ms. Whitmore, your family is naming you as the primary architect of this scheme." I felt my knees go soft. I had spent 20 years building a reputation on catching exactly this kind of crime, and my own family had just used my name to commit it. Thank you for listening to my story. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe, like, and hit the bell so you never miss the next one. Every share helps these stories reach someone who needs to hear them. Let's keep the conversation going. I drove to my parents' house the moment the agents cleared my kitchen. I needed to look at their faces. I had spent my entire career reading financial documents for signs of deception, and I had learned long ago that people's faces told the same story their numbers did if you knew how to look. My mother was sitting at the kitchen table when I walked in, crying into a folded tissue in the way she did when she wanted to appear devastated without committing to it fully. My father was standing near the window with his hands in his pockets. He looked calm. Too calm for a man whose company was under federal investigation. He turned when I walked in and said simply, "You signed the documents." My brother was sitting in the corner chair, and he would not look at me directly. When I asked to see the internal authorization logs, my father's voice sharpened and he said, "Do you think I would do this to you?" My brother stared at the floor and muttered that I was always the smart one and that I would find a way to fix it. That was the moment I understood. They had already decided who was going to take the fall. They had decided before I even walked through the door. By that same evening, my firm had placed me on immediate suspension, pending the outcome of the investigation. The email from HR was 3 sentences long and completely impersonal. I sat in my car in the parking garage and read it twice. When I drove home through my neighborhood, I noticed the way a woman I had waved to every morning for 6 years suddenly found something very interesting to look at in her garden as I passed. My ex-husband called within the hour. He didn't ask if I was all right. He asked about our daughter and what I planned to tell her. I kept my voice steady and told him I would handle it. After I ended the call, I opened my laptop and pulled up every document I could still access. I started with the timestamps on the fraudulent approvals. I went through them methodically, the way I had been trained to, line by line. 3 of the approval timestamps showed dates when I had been at a forensic accounting conference in Denver. I had the hotel receipts, the conference badge scans, and the session sign-in sheets to prove it. Someone had used my professional credentials while I was standing in a conference hall 800 miles away. I found my brother alone at his apartment the following afternoon. I had thought carefully about how to approach him on the drive over. My brother was not a strong person. He had always needed approval from our father in a way that made him easy to direct and difficult to reason with when our father was the one directing him. But I also knew that when he was genuinely frightened, he became honest in a way he couldn't control. I sat across from him at his kitchen table, and I didn't accuse him of anything. I just told him what I had found in the timestamps. I watched his face while I talked. He lasted about 4 minutes before everything came apart behind his eyes. He told me our father had been quietly moving money for over a year to cover significant investment losses before any investors or banks discovered the shortfall. The banks had trusted my professional record. My clean history had made me the most useful name to attach to approvals that needed to appear legitimate. My brother looked at the table when he said the final part. He said our father had told him it had to be me because no one would question my signature. They hadn't just betrayed me in a moment of panic. They had calculated exactly which one of us was most valuable as a shield. The prosecutor called again 2 days later. His name was Walter Hines, and I had looked him up the night before. He had a strong conviction record and a reputation for being methodical and thorough. When he called the first time, his voice had been completely professional and neutral. This time there was something different in it. A quality I recognized from years of sitting across tables from people who had seen something that didn't add up and hadn't yet decided what to do with it. He told me off the record that certain elements of the case were not sitting right with him. He did not elaborate beyond that. What he told me directly was that I needed to retain independent forensic review of all the evidence attached to my name immediately, and that I needed to do it through my own attorney without any connection to my family's legal representation. He said $12 million had moved through accounts bearing my authorizations. He said my name was on every significant approval in the chain. Then he paused and added one more sentence before he ended the call. He said, "Get the best forensic team you can find and give them everything." When my father's company locked me out of the internal systems, I was not surprised. What they did not know was that 6 years earlier, during a period when the company's data infrastructure was dangerously disorganized, I had personally designed and implemented an archival mirror system. It ran automatic encrypted backups of all system activity to an offsite server on a rolling 90-day cycle. I had built it to protect the company from exactly the kind of data loss that comes with sudden system failures or deliberate file deletions. I had documented it, filed the technical specifications with the IT department, and then largely forgotten about it once the system was running smoothly. When they locked me out of the live systems, I sat very still for a moment and thought about whether that mirror system would still be active. If it was, it had been quietly recording everything, including every login, every credential use, and every document authorization for the past 6 years. And they had not thought to disable it because they had forgotten I built it. I worked through my attorney to access the archival mirror system through a formal legal preservation request so that every piece of data would be fully admissible. It took 8 days and 2 court filings. When we finally got in, my forensic consultant spent 48 hours going through the logs. The results were detailed and very clear. The fraud activity inside the company system had begun approximately 2 years after I had formally resigned from any operational role at my father's company. My professional credentials had remained inactive in the system during that entire period, exactly as they should have been after a resignation. Then, 14 months before the investigation broke open, my credentials had been quietly reactivated inside the system by an administrator with override authority. There was no request on file from me. There was no communication from me asking for that access to be restored. Someone with the right system permissions had reached into the company's access controls and turned my credentials back on without my knowledge, without my consent, and without leaving any official documentation of why. My parents appeared on a local television news segment 4 days after the investigation became public. I watched it alone in my apartment with a cup of coffee that went cold while they spoke. My mother sat close to my father on a small sofa in what looked like a living room I didn't recognize, and she spoke softly about how difficult the past years had been for our family. My father talked about the company, about the pressures of leadership, about how much he had trusted certain people around him. Neither of them used my name directly. But my mother mentioned, in a voice full of gentle concern, that I had been through a very difficult divorce and that the emotional toll of it had affected me in ways that were hard to watch as a parent. My father nodded slowly when she said it. A reporter asked a follow-up question, and my father said carefully that he had always tried to support me, but that sometimes people made decisions that were difficult to understand. They were not defending themselves on that program. They were building a story about who I was that had nothing to do with the truth. They were rewriting me before the public had formed any opinion of their own. Walter Hines called me urgently on a Thursday morning, earlier than I expected. His voice had the particular tightness of someone managing several moving pieces at once. He told me a whistleblower had come forward to the investigation team the previous evening. The individual had provided a detailed account claiming that my father had personally and directly ordered the reactivation of my system credentials and had given specific instructions on how my name was to be attached to the authorization chain in a way that would appear entirely routine to any outside reviewer. Walter said the whistleblower's account was specific, internally consistent, and corroborated several elements the investigation team had already identified independently. But the whistleblower had one firm condition before they would go on record formally. They wanted full prosecutorial immunity from any charges related to their own involvement in the events. Walter said negotiations were ongoing. Someone on the inside was frightened enough to speak. And frightened people, in my experience, almost always eventually told the truth. My father came to my apartment that night without calling ahead. I opened the door and looked at him for a moment before stepping back to let him in. He sat in the chair near the window and looked around the apartment with an expression I couldn't immediately name. He told me the situation could be managed if I was willing to handle it cleanly. He said a quiet plea arrangement, something structured to minimize publicity and court time, would be the most practical path forward for everyone involved. He said dragging it through a full trial would be devastating for my mother, and that she didn't deserve that kind of extended public attention at her age. He spoke in the same measured, reasonable tone he had used my entire life when he wanted me to do something I wouldn't have chosen on my own. I sat across from him and listened to every word without interrupting. He talked for almost 20 minutes. When he finally finished, I told him I would think carefully about everything he had said. After he left, I went to my phone and played back the full recording I had been running from the moment I opened the door. Then I sent the file directly to my attorney. I spent 3 days building a complete vendor analysis from the archival data my forensic team had extracted. I mapped every shell company that had received payments through the fraudulent authorization chain, tracking the fund flows through the layered transfer structure my father had used. The architecture was sophisticated enough to suggest the involvement of someone with serious financial engineering knowledge. My father had that knowledge. His CFO had it too. But what made me stop completely was a vendor mailing address I found attached to one of the shell companies near the bottom of the payment chain. The address was a commercial building in the newer part of the city. I recognized it immediately. My brother had moved into a luxury condominium in that exact building 8 months earlier, shortly after telling me he had received an unexpected inheritance payout from an account our grandfather had set up years ago. I called him from my car outside his building. He answered on the third ring. When I read him the vendor address, his breathing changed completely. He said our father had told him the whole thing would blow over before anyone traced it that far down. The CFO's name was Bernard Cutler. He had been my father's closest professional friend for over 20 years and had served as the company's chief financial officer for the last 11 of them. Bernard was the one person in the entire organization with the system authority to perform the kind of software overrides that the archival logs showed had been used to reactivate my credentials and mask the origin points of the fraudulent approvals. When my attorney submitted a formal request for Bernard's cooperation in the forensic review, we received a response from his personal attorney stating that Bernard was currently traveling internationally for health-related reasons and was unavailable for any proceedings. My forensic consultant checked his travel records through publicly available departure data. Bernard had left the country 4 days before the federal investigation became public knowledge. A man who leaves a country 4 days before an investigation breaks open is not traveling for his health. He had known exactly what was coming, which meant he had been told. Which meant the exit had been planned as part of the same operation that had been designed to leave my name on every document while the people who wrote them disappeared. The whistleblower formally identified himself to the investigation team 10 days after Walter Hines first told me about him. His name was Neil Grady, and he had served as the company's IT director for 7 years. Neil had kept printed copies of internal emails he had received and sent during the period when the credential reactivation and system overrides were being carried out. He turned over the full collection to the investigation team through his immunity agreement. Walter called me the morning after Neil's formal statement and read me one line from one of the emails. It was a message sent from my father's private company account to Bernard Cutler and copied to Neil Grady. The subject line was blank. The body of the email contained several lines of technical instruction about the credential reactivation process. The final line of the email read, "Claire's signature will protect us." I sat with the phone against my ear and read those 5 words again in my head. I had spent my entire professional life protecting other people's financial integrity. My own father had looked at that reputation and seen it as the most useful tool he owned. The preliminary hearing was scheduled 6 weeks after the investigation became public. My attorney, a woman named Paula Gentry, who had 20 years of white-collar defense experience, presented the timestamp inconsistencies from the Denver conference period as our opening evidence. She laid out the archival log data showing the unauthorized credential reactivation. She presented the complete absence of any request or documentation from me authorizing the restoration of my system access. The judge listened without interrupting and asked several precise questions about the forensic methodology used to extract and verify the archival data. My attorney answered each one clearly. At the end of the presentation, the judge ordered a comprehensive independent forensic review of all digital evidence attached to the case before any further proceedings could advance. I watched my father's face when the judge announced the order. He had been sitting at a separate table across the room with his own legal team, and he had maintained his usual composed expression through the entire hearing. But when the judge said the words independent forensic review, his expression changed in a way that was very small and very clear. For the first time since this had all begun, he looked uncertain about the outcome. The week after the preliminary hearing, my father's attorney released a public statement announcing that I had been formally removed from any consideration in the family's estate and financial arrangements, effective immediately. It was framed as a decision made with great sadness following the revelation of my alleged conduct. 2 days after that, a local journalist published a story citing anonymous sources who claimed I had a history of erratic behavior following my divorce, and that colleagues at my firm had raised concerns about my judgment in the period before the fraud was discovered. The sourcing was thin and the claims were vague, but the story circulated online for several days. I read it once and put my phone face down on the table. That evening, my daughter called me from her father's house. She was 14 and she had the kind of steady, careful voice that told me she had been thinking about what she wanted to say for some time before she dialed. She asked me quietly if I had done what the news was saying. I told her no. She said okay, and then she said, "Then promise me you'll win, Mom." I told her I promised. And I meant it in a way I had not meant anything in a very long time. The independent forensic team appointed by the court completed their digital evidence review in 30 days. On the morning their report was submitted to the court, Walter Hines called me before I had seen any of it. His voice carried the particular quality of a man delivering information he had been waiting to deliver for some time. The forensic team had recovered deleted files from the backup systems in Bernard Cutler's former office. The deleted files included logs from a remote login spoofing operation, a technical process that allows a user in one physical location to make their digital activity appear to originate from a completely different location. The forensic team had traced the actual origin point of the spoofed logins used to generate my fraudulent approvals. The IP address trail, reconstructed through multiple layers of routing data, led to a residential broadband connection registered to a property in the Lake District outside the city. My parents owned a lake house in that exact area. They had not just framed me from a distance using my credentials. They had sat in their weekend retreat and operated the machinery of my destruction from there. My brother took the witness stand during the evidentiary phase of the proceedings. He had agreed to testify under a cooperation arrangement with the prosecution in exchange for reduced charges against him personally. I was sitting in the courtroom when he walked in, and I watched him settle into the witness chair without looking at anyone directly. He was thinner than the last time I had seen him, and he held his hands very still in his lap the way people do when they are trying to appear calm. Walter Hines walked him through the timeline carefully and methodically. My brother answered each question in a flat, steady voice that sounded like someone who had rehearsed the words enough times that they had stopped carrying weight. Then Walter asked him directly who had made the decision to use my professional credentials as the authorization mechanism for the fraudulent approval chain. My brother looked at his hands. The courtroom went very quiet. Then he said our father had given the instruction. He said our father had planned it specifically around my professional reputation. He said our father had told them both that no investigator would look too hard at approvals bearing the signature of a forensic accountant with a 20-year clean record. My father was sitting across the room and he stared at me the entire time my brother spoke, like I was the one who had betrayed something. I thought the testimony was the final piece. I thought after my brother's statement under oath the direction of everything was clear and settled. Then Walter called me the evening after that hearing with a warning in his voice that told me something new had surfaced. He said the forensic team had flagged something in the IP routing analysis that needed to be addressed directly before the case could move forward cleanly. Some of the fraudulent approval logins had not originated from the Lake House connection. A smaller cluster of them had originated from an IP address registered to my own home broadband account. My own home. My stomach dropped in a way that felt physical, like something had shifted inside my body without permission. I had not generated those logins. I had not been near my system on those dates. But the data showed my home connection as the origination point, and I had no immediate explanation for how that was possible. Walter told me to think carefully about anyone who had ever had access to my home network equipment. He said the forensic team would need to physically examine my router hardware as soon as possible. I thought back through every person who had been inside my home in the past several years with any access to my network infrastructure. The answer came to me at 2 in the morning, sitting at my kitchen table with the lights on and a cold cup of tea in front of me. 3 years before the fraud began, my father had called me on a Sunday afternoon and offered to send a technician to upgrade my home internet equipment. He had said my setup was outdated and that he had a contact at a provider who could do it at no cost as a favor. I had said yes without thinking about it because it had seemed like a simple and generous offer from my father. The technician had spent about 40 minutes in my home and had replaced the router unit and reconfigured the connection. I had not thought about it again from that day until this moment. I called my attorney at 7 the next morning. The forensic team had my router examined within 24 hours. Embedded inside the hardware casing, attached to the routing board, was a small remote access device that had been installed at the factory level of the unit's assembly. My father had not just framed me when the investigation began. He had walked into my home 3 years earlier and pre-built the frame before the fraud had even started. They arrested my father on a Tuesday morning outside the offices of his personal attorney on the east side of the city. I was not there and I did not watch the footage until later that evening when Walter sent me a brief message saying it had gone smoothly. I watched the recording once on my laptop. My father was walking from the building's front entrance toward a waiting car when 2 federal agents approached him from either side. There were cameras from 2 different news outlets present, which suggested the timing had not been entirely coincidental. He was placed in handcuffs and guided toward a federal vehicle with the calm efficiency of people who had done this many times before. He said something loudly as he was walked toward the car. The audio from one of the cameras was clear enough to make it out. He said I was ungrateful. He said it the way a person says something when they have run out of everything more useful. I watched that moment and waited for some version of satisfaction to arrive. What came instead was something much quieter. It felt like clarity. Like a window being cleaned so thoroughly that you could finally see through it without distortion. My mother called me the morning after my father's arrest. I answered because I had decided some time earlier that I would not refuse contact with her. That refusing felt like a kind of weight I didn't want to carry. She spoke for a while before she arrived at anything real. Then she said she had known. Not all of it and not from the beginning. But she had understood enough of what was happening to know that I was being used as protection, and she had chosen not to intervene. She said she had been trying to protect the family. She said it in a voice that was genuinely quiet and genuinely sad, which made it harder to respond to than anger would have been. I told her that I understood what she had tried to protect. Then I told her that she had protected the wrong person and that the cost of that choice was going to be significant. She was subpoenaed to provide testimony the following week. I did not call her before she testified, and she did not call me. Whatever was left between us after everything was something that would take far longer than a phone call to understand. Walter called one final time before the trial concluded. His voice had changed from every previous call in a way that was immediately noticeable. The tightness was gone. He sounded like a man standing on solid ground who could see clearly in every direction. He told me the surveillance team had obtained footage and financial records showing my father making a series of in-person cash withdrawals from multiple bank branches over a period of several weeks, in amounts carefully structured to avoid automatic reporting flags. The withdrawals corresponded precisely to the timing of several large transfers in the Shell company payment chain. He said the records were clean, comprehensive, and entirely airtight in terms of admissibility. He said Bernard Cutler had been located and had agreed to cooperate with authorities from the country he had fled to in exchange for arrangements regarding extradition proceedings. He said the forensic picture was now complete from every direction simultaneously. Then he used a phrase I had not heard from him in any previous conversation. He said, "We are ready." 2 words. But after 4 months of building this case piece by piece from a kitchen table surrounded by federal agents, those 2 words felt like the most solid thing anyone had said to me in a very long time. The verdict came on a Wednesday afternoon. My father was found guilty on multiple federal counts, including wire fraud, conspiracy to commit financial fraud, obstruction of justice, and criminal impersonation through unauthorized system access. My brother had cooperated fully throughout the proceedings and received a significantly reduced outcome in exchange, but his professional life was finished, and his financial situation had been completely dismantled by the restitution requirements attached to his cooperation agreement. Bernard Cutler was convicted in separate proceedings conducted partially through international legal cooperation. My mother received a suspended sentence and a substantial fine in recognition of her limited direct role and her eventual cooperation with investigators. My father sat at his table when the verdict was read, and for the first time in my life, he looked small. Not physically, but in some more essential way. The quality that had always made him seem larger than the room he was in, the certainty and the control, had simply left his face. He was just a man sitting in a chair waiting to hear what happened next. I had spent 40 years being shaped by my fear of disappointing him. Watching the verdict land, I realized I had not thought about that fear in months. The charges against me were formally dismissed 2 days after the verdict. Paula released a brief public statement on my behalf, and my firm's managing partner called me personally that same afternoon. He said the firm wanted me back. He said they were prepared to issue a full public statement acknowledging that I had been the victim of a deliberate and sophisticated framing operation, and that my professional record and personal integrity were entirely intact. I told him I would think about it and that I would call him by the end of the week. I sat in my apartment after that call and tried to locate the feeling I had expected to feel at this moment. I had imagined it many times during the previous months. I had thought it would feel like being released from something. What it actually felt like was quieter than that. My record was clean. My name was restored. But I was not the same person who had stood in her kitchen with federal agents moving through her house 4 months earlier. That woman had believed that doing everything right was enough protection against the people closest to her. I no longer believed that. And I was not sure yet whether losing that belief was a loss or something more useful than what it had replaced. My father requested a meeting with me in the week before his sentencing. The request came through his attorney and was framed as a personal matter separate from any legal proceedings. I agreed to go. We met in a small room in the federal building with an officer present near the door. My father looked older than he had at the trial. He sat with his hands on the table and he asked me, in a voice that had lost most of its familiar authority, whether there was anything I could do to support a request for a reduced sentence given the circumstances of his age and his health. He said he knew he had made serious mistakes. He used that word. Mistakes. I looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Then I told him that he had taught me something valuable when I was young, something I had carried my entire career. He had told me that the most important thing a person could do when they had caused harm was to stand in front of it honestly and accept the full weight of what they owed. I told him I had finally done that myself, in the hardest possible circumstances, without anyone helping me carry it. Then I stood up, thanked the officer near the door, and walked out of that room and down the corridor and out of the building into the afternoon light. I had not destroyed my father. He had done that with the same careful deliberateness he had brought to everything else. What I had done was survive it, document it, and refuse to disappear the way he had counted on me to. They had framed me because they believed I was the safest choice. They had forgotten, or perhaps they had never truly understood, that I was also the strongest one.